It's exciting because we're only a few weeks from Easter. I hope that you're already praying through and preparing your heart for this time of year that is literally the height of the Christian calendar. It's a reminder of the gospel of Jesus and all that Jesus did to make us his own. I hope that you're already thinking about how you're going to invite someone to be a part of our gatherings with you. Good Friday, always one of the most incredible gatherings we have at any point in time throughout the year. Love the Good Friday service and hope that you're going to be a part of that. And then our Easter Sunday, I pray that you're thinking through who you're going to invite over for lunch, what family member you're going to convince to be a part of the gathering with you, because you're going to take them out to eat afterwards. Just be thinking about creative ways to bring people along, and know that we're going to be faithful to preach the gospel of Jesus. So anyone you bring, they will encounter the gospel. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. I'm going to be preaching a passage today that I've never heard preached on in all of my life, and that's saying something, because my dad was a pastor, evangelist, and we traveled all over America. I would hear, I can't even begin to count how many sermons a year. I thought that this passage was only going to be a part of today's message, but once I found myself in the passage, it just became so exciting to me, and I believe it really strongly communicates everything that needs to be said today as we talk about the real Jesus. Everything today is going to be built on this foundation. The real Jesus valued people over religious expectations and religious approval. Let me just say that once more. The real Jesus valued people over religious expectations and religious approval. By viewing people not as minions to be used for the increase of his power and wealth like the religious leaders were doing, but by viewing people as his mission and dedicating his power and the wealth of his life to seek them and to save them. The priority of religion was performance. The priority of Jesus was people. So while religion focused on showing people how to keep the legal demands of the religious laws, Jesus focused on showing people the outrageous love of a gracious God who would see their faults and their needs not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity. The great example of this that I want to point out to you today is found in Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. This passage has historically been referred to as Jesus healing the man with the withered hand. The Bible says Jesus entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a shriveled hand. In order to accuse him, they were watching him closely to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath. He told the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand before us. Stand before us." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. After looking around at them with anger, he was grieved at the hardness of their hearts and told the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Immediately, the Pharisees went out and started plotting with the Herodians against him, how they might kill him. These verses really give us the incredible opportunity to enter this ancient synagogue with Jesus. And through the scripture, encounter this man who was in the synagogue with a medical condition that according to Luke was affecting his right arm. The ancient description in the Bible was a withered or a shriveled hand, which likely described either muscle atrophy due to nerve damage or a stroke, or a spinal cord injury that resulted in a paralytic arm that over time literally wasted away. Regardless of the cause, we know the Bible is describing a chronic condition. A chronic condition that would have affected virtually every area of this man's life, would have impacted every day of his life, and in some way made every day difficult. Because of the way the verses are written, I'd never really thought about this in this way before, but because of the way the verses are written, we can stand in this synagogue in our imagination and see this moment through the eyes of the religious leaders and through the eyes of Jesus. If you read the verses and you think about the verses in that way, you can picture yourself standing in the room. There's the man with the withered hand or the withered arm. There's Jesus who is entering the synagogue. And then there are the Pharisees that are watching Jesus enter the room and encounter this man with this painful disability. We don't have to speculate or interpret what Jesus was thinking or what the religious leaders were thinking. The Bible tells us they were both looking at the same situation in the same moment. But Jesus' view and the religious leaders' view could not have possibly been more opposed. Jesus saw the man's condition and he looked on this man with compassion. Compassion motivated Jesus to see a need. So Jesus walks in, the man's there, Jesus sees the man, and immediately his condition provokes compassion in the heart of Jesus. He sees a man who's suffering and a man who is overlooked. The religious leaders were so calloused. They looked at the man. They looked at the condition of the man. But look in the verses just real quickly. You're going to notice they didn't see the man. They were looking at him, but they didn't really see him. They were the cause of him being overlooked. He likely would have been at the synagogue every week. Historically, according to Jewish tradition and Jewish culture at that time, people with various infirmities, and you see this at different times throughout the Bible, they would attend religious gatherings. And it would be at these religious gatherings that they would beg for alms because there were commands that required at least some generosity. Of course, it was for public spectacle, but these people would enter the synagogue and they would carry out this act of generosity. And so often those who had to beg for money, they would be in the presence of the religious, especially on a day like the Sabbath. He was just another person with just another need, hoping for a handout. That's how they would have viewed him. The religious leaders, they never thought of providing any hope for this man at all. This man who had given up on hope as he suffered the pain of an arm that was withering away. The reason they never thought about offering him hope was because religion can't offer anyone any real hope at all. Religion offers rules. Religion offers rituals. Religion offers regulations, but religion can't offer real relationship with Jesus. It can only offer what is designed to convince a person that as an individual, he or she is appeasing God. But meaningless religious practices can't offer anyone a true, authentic encounter with God. It can't. And the darkness of these religious leaders, legalistic hearts, it was exposed that day. It's actually exposed even still on the pages of the Bible. Notice as Jesus enters the room, they could not even bring themselves to hope that Jesus would provide a miracle that would end this man's misery. He couldn't even bring themselves to hope for that. Instead, the Bible says, and in this passage, if you'll read it, you'll notice there are a lot of he and hims and theirs. There's a lot of that language, so it's a little confusing. In order to accuse him, that's the Pharisees. The him is Jesus. The Pharisees are looking for an opportunity to accuse Jesus. And so they were watching him, that's Jesus, closely to see whether Jesus, would heal him. That's the man with the withered hand on the Sabbath. So Jesus enters the room, and immediately they cast a condemning eye. They start to watch Jesus closely to see what Jesus is going to do, because after all, it is the Sabbath. Now, these verses should leave us with two emotions: anger and sadness. Anger, because those religious leaders were so concerned about rules and regulations that had been attached to a day that they didn't even see a man who was desperately in need. They were only concerned that their rules and their regulations were going to be violated. They were blind to a man being given his life back. They were blind to a family being given their loved one, their father, their husband back. For them, rules took priority over the person. And that should make us angry, and that should also make us sad. For Jesus, the person took priority over the religious rules and over religious affirmation. Jesus had rather meet this man's need than be affirmed by the religious leaders. Now imagine this moment. Jesus, who was fully God, understood the gift of Sabbath. It had been Jesus who had gifted the Sabbath. Jesus understood resting on the seventh day after creation, because John tells us all things were created by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Jesus fully understood the letter of the Sabbath, but Jesus also knew the heart of God. Jesus understood the gift of Sabbath. Now, God commanded rest so that there would be an opportunity to experience him while enjoying family and friends. I saw this firsthand when I was in Israel. On the Sabbath day, they still gather on that day. They prepare all their food the day before, and they gather that day. They celebrate with family. They rest. They enjoy the entire day. You can hear singing. You can hear music playing. There's celebration. And this happens on their calendar every single week. False religion did what false religion does and changed the definition in order to alter what keeping the Sabbath meant. In Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, this was what God commanded. Keep the Sabbath day holy. Rest from working. Let your children rest from working. Let your servants rest from working. Let your livestock rest from working. That was God's command. Religion wasn't satisfied with what God had said, and religion determined that there needed to be greater clarity. People are not going to understand what God meant by working. And so we need to take on the responsibility of clarifying exactly what God meant. So religion, not God, defined work. And then said, based on their definitions, this is what it means to keep the Sabbath day holy. One of the greatest issues, still an issue today, religion elevated their rules and regulations to a place of equality with God's commands. They treated rules and regulations that did not come directly from God as if they had come directly from God. And so they had different rules. I'm going to just give you a few of them. Their rules governed how far you could walk on the Sabbath. So on the Sabbath, you could walk a half mile or 5/10 of a mile, but you couldn't walk 6/10 or 7/10 of a mile. If you went beyond that, it was considered a violation. I don't know who was responsible for watching. Who was policing how far everybody walked? I don't know. I do know this. When I was in Israel, you still see their legalisms at work even now, because when you stay in a hotel in Israel, on the Sabbath day, they literally have a Sabbath elevator. It's only one elevator. And so that you don't have to go through the hard task of pressing an elevator button, the elevator literally stops at every floor on the Sabbath day. And so they made these rules like that. You can't walk beyond 5/10 of a mile. Their rules also governed what you could carry on the Sabbath. And there were those who argued so strictly for this, they even argued and tried to convince people to believe that carrying a plate of food on the Sabbath day was a violation. Now, let me just ask a question real quickly, just for a survey. How many people in the room love to eat? Would you just raise your hand if you love to eat? I know some of you eat to live, and then the rest of us live to eat. How many of you're there with me? So how many of you, when you have a plate of delicious food, does anybody feel like you're working when you're headed to the table? According to the Pharisees, that was unacceptable. It was a violation. Their rules dictated that you weren't allowed to write more than 2 letters on the Sabbath. And while you're writing your 2 letters, you had better not make any mistakes, because all erasing on the Sabbath was forbidden. It was a violation. Cooking any food or preparing any food on the Sabbath, it was forbidden. It was a violation. And on and on and on the rules and the regulations went. I shared with you before, true story, you can look this up on your own time. But on the Sabbath day, if you needed to spit, you couldn't spit until you found a rock to spit on, because they literally had a rule that you couldn't spit on the ground, because if you did, it might make an indention, and the wind would blow a seed into the indention, and your spit would water the seed, and that would be considered planting on the Sabbath day, and that was a violation. Now, the reason this moment in Mark's gospel was so intense is because one of the rules was being violated. Because one of their rules dictated that there could be no healing on the Sabbath. A person was only allowed to intervene if there was a life-threatening emergency. All non-life-threatening emergencies required waiting until after the Sabbath day had concluded. And Jesus on the Sabbath is walking into the synagogue, and their minds and their thoughts immediately go to their list of rules and regulations. Was the man suffering? Yes. Was his condition non-life-threatening? Yes. And so they're watching to see if Jesus is going to violate their rules and regulations. Now, these religious rules, they empowered the religious leaders in Mark chapter 3 to do what they were doing against Jesus that day in the synagogue. Notice it's right in the text. They were watching him closely. Does everybody in the room understand that that's almost always overly religious people's favorite activity? To watch other people closely. Has anyone in the room ever been watched closely by someone who was religious? Someone who believed that they were more righteous than you. And so they're watching closely. Not expecting a miracle, but expecting a mistake. And this is sad. A mistake would actually bring them more joy than a miracle. And Jesus silenced them by confronting them with their error. His underlying message seemed to be to ignore the needs of people because it is the Sabbath is evil. To do good for those in need regardless of the day, that is pleasing to God. And the Bible then says this about the real Jesus. After looking around at them with anger, he was grieved at the hardness of their hearts. I wish I could see that moment. The real Jesus filled with anger, filled with righteous indignation toward these religious legalists. He looks around the room. I imagine this means he's basically making eye contact with every single one of them. And it's obvious he's angry. And then his anger, that becomes a grieved heart because of the hardness of their hearts. Jesus is grieved that they could be so calloused, that they could be so cold. And the word grieved describes exactly what Jesus was feeling in that moment. It means to be deeply saddened or distressed. Jesus felt the deepest degree of sadness. The hardness of their hearts distressed him. The Pharisees' lack of concern for the need of this man and their condemnation of Jesus, it was both infuriating and heartbreaking. But it led to this incredibly beautiful moment of Jesus showing that he had no regard for the affirmation or the approval of these religious leaders. And he actually cared. He had compassion for the one in need. By the way, can I just point this out to you quickly? Jesus had rather be needed by the weak and burdened than approved of by the religious and powerful. So Jesus ignored the disapproval of the religious in the room, and he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And his hand was restored. This moment had to mean so much to this man. Just over 2 weeks ago, I had surgery. Thank all of you who prayed for me. But I had surgery, and if you look, I've got this scar across the front of my neck. They cut my neck. They went back to my spine because I had a disc that had collapsed on a nerve. For the past 3 years, I've been living with a lot of pain in my right arm. I try not to mention too much about any of this, but how many of you have noticed some Sundays me keeping my arm tucked in my pocket and tightly against my body? Those were the days I was just trying to survive, literally preaching while praying that God would help me be able to concentrate through the pain. Well, over the last 3 years, that's really started affecting my life more and more and more. The things I could do, the things I couldn't do, the pain, the fear of a flare up, it just became a burden. And recently, over the past few months, I'd started losing a lot of strength in my right arm, just a lot of inability to use my right arm, and I'm right hand dependent. And so I went to the neurosurgeon again. He's been putting off the surgery. They've tried some other things in hopes that that would help. None of that did. I went for the MRI. He looked at it and he said, "This is bad." And I said, "That's what I've been trying to tell you." By the way, when doctors say we're going to keep a watch on this, just know when you walk out of the room, they're not watching anything. You're dealing with that. So he said, "This is bad. We're going to get you in quickly for surgery." So 2.5 weeks later, they had me in the operating room. I'm going to be honest with you. That morning when I arrived at the surgical center, I was the happiest patient they could possibly have. I'm joking with everybody. I'm excited. I'm ready for them to take me back. I'm ready for this to happen. Why? Because I'm anticipating the relief of literally having my right arm again. And I just noticed earlier while preaching that I was using my right arm more and that it's not hurting, which means I can point while I'm preaching right at Dan. And I can do that again. So be ready, be prepared for that. I know how excited I am that now I'm starting to heal and I'm getting relief. I can't even begin to imagine how excited this man was. This Jesus who performs miracles is now standing in front of you and he's inviting you, stretch out your hand. This had to be an exciting moment. And then his hand was restored. Just imagine the joy and the gratitude and the hopefulness of this moment. Jesus had gifted this man with the impossible. And imagine his excitement as he thought about rushing home and declaring this miracle that he's received to his family. But this was the response of the religious leaders. Immediately, the Pharisees went out and started plotting with the Herodians against him, how they might kill him. Does that not show you the depravity of the heart blinded by false religion? They witness a miracle, and their response is, "That man has to die." You need to understand, in the ancient world, this man would have likely been a beggar, which means he would have been viewed as nothing more than a liability. He basically meant nothing to society. This is big. I've never seen this pointed out in this passage, so I want you to receive this. It makes such a great statement about the real Jesus. This man was a liability. He was overlooked. He was invisible. And Jesus healed him in the presence of the religious leaders, knowing that miracle in that moment would bring him one step closer to being nailed to a cross. Jesus healed this man, knowing it would be that miracle that would begin the conversation among the religious leaders about the crucifixion of Jesus. And this makes the real Jesus look so beautiful, doesn't it? Religion was concerned with being right. Jesus was concerned with being loving. And it's important that you understand, had the real Jesus wanted to be wealthy and powerful, he could have been. Had he gathered the masses that came to hear him preach in the name of religion, religion would have loved him. Had he performed miracles and healed the sick and raised the dead for the fame and the financial gain of religion, they would have loved him. Had he submitted to their rules and promoted their practices, they would have loved him. He would have enjoyed every luxury society had to offer. Had he only embraced the Jewish leaders' religion, he could have even avoided the cross. But the real Jesus loved people too much to point them to a false hope. The real Jesus loved people too much to point them to a false truth. The real Jesus, well, he had already taken on himself the form of a servant. And according to Philippians 2, he was already obedient to death on a cross. So picture it. Try to go there in your imagination, would you? Picture the moment. Jesus enters the synagogue. Over here, there stands this group of religious Pharisees, and they're wearing all of their religious clothing, and they've got the smug look of condemnation and legalism on their faces. And in walks Jesus. And between Jesus and the religious leaders, there's this man with the withered hand. And Jesus looked into the faces of those who would plot his death and say to a man that they would have never cared about and they could have never possibly healed, stretch out your hand. I'm going to make you whole no matter what it costs me. I'm going to give you your miracle no matter what it costs me. Doesn't matter what it cost. And this man's not the only one. This trend continued throughout the Gospels. There was the Samaritan woman at the well. Jews didn't interact with Samaritans. As a matter of fact, Jews would walk out of their way to avoid Samaria. Not only was this woman at the well a Samaritan, but she was connected to sexual sin. It violated every rule for Jesus to have a conversation with her. But yet Jesus cared so much he wanted her to have living water. There's the leper that Jesus touched. Lepers lived in leper colonies. They could only live among other lepers. As a matter of fact, when they were walking down the street, as they were approaching someone at a certain distance, they would have to start to cry out, "Unclean, unclean." And they would have to call that out over and over and over again, drawing attention to their leprosy so that people could avoid them and pass on the other side of the road. and Jesus touched the leper. The woman who was hemorrhaging blood, who touched the hem of his garment. I'm going to talk about this soon, but she wasn't even supposed to be in public. She wasn't supposed to touch anyone, and no one was to allow her to touch them. And yet Jesus broke all of the rules for the sake of meeting this woman's need. Those stories are all throughout the life of Jesus. And Hope Church, I want to remind you today, and I want you to listen closely. This is so important. If your theology makes you indifferent to someone in need, then your theology is broken. And I never want you to have the idea that your Christianity has anything to do with your goodness or your moral accomplishments or your ability to satisfy the necessary requirements. And the reason I pray that never happens in your life is because I never want to see you become an accidental Pharisee by taking credit for what Jesus has and what Jesus is doing in you. We are not good because we are Christians. We are Christians because we were incapable of being good. And we were graciously saved by Jesus Christ. How sad is it that the church is often a breeding ground for accidental Pharisees when the church should be a breeding ground for compassionate hearts and people who look at other people not focused on their sin, but focused on their need. Not focused on their shortfall, but focused on their need. Don't master theological conversations at the expense of practically caring for those who are broken. I want to show you this and I'm finished. This is so awesome. I was reading this text and I was studying this text. And this is the point of the text. And yet, I've never heard anybody preach on these passages, and I've never heard anybody bring this out before. But it's just so awesome. The Pharisees completely missed it that day in the synagogue. They completely missed it. Now, they were convinced that the Sabbath pointed to rest. As a matter of fact, they could have given you a note binder of all of the rules and the regulations related to what it meant to rest. They were completely convinced of that. But that day in the synagogue, they were blind to the fact that Jesus was that rest. God graciously placed Jesus in their presence, and they were blind to who he was. They were convinced the Sabbath pointed to rest. But they didn't believe that it was the real Jesus who was the only one who could look out over a hurting world a broken world, a spiritually bankrupt world, and extend this loving invitation. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. Jesus didn't say, if you won't rest, look to a day. Jesus didn't say, if you want real rest, look to a few designated hours on a calendar. No, Jesus said, if you want real rest, come to me and I will give you rest. Jesus gave this man a miracle, knowing it would start the conversation of the cross. But Jesus died on the cross, knowing it would be the cross that would make it possible for him to give you and me the miracle of salvation. If you're in the room today and you're not a Christian, Jesus values you, and he's proven it. Jesus knows your need. Jesus knows your problems. Jesus knows your issues. And Jesus still says, I value you. And then I would say to every Christian in the room, we cannot be like Jesus while being trapped in the judgmentalism of religion and failing to show the love and the compassion of Jesus to those who are in need. And we need to pray that Jesus would free our hearts from being accidental Pharisees. Let's take just a moment and let's pray. And some of you in this room, your prayer needs to be, Jesus, save me today. I trust you. Others of you need to pray, Jesus, remind me of what you've done for me and help me be more mindful of those in need. Let's take a moment. Let's pray.